Well, welcome everybody. My name is Simon Nicholson. I co-direct the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us today for one of our occasional webinars. Today's session is titled Communicating Carbon Removal. This will be an hour-long session. Now, carbon removal is a complex thing, and on the technical side, there are lots of things that we can talk about. There are different proposals at different levels of readiness, and they present very different opportunities and risks. But having a conversation about what carbon removal is and what it might look like adds additional layers of complexity. There are lots of big social and political questions that we need to address. Is carbon removal really needed to combat climate change? If so, what kinds at what scales? How should one approach to carbon removal be compared to other approaches? What kinds of research are needed? Who's going to help us sort through all of these questions? When we lay these questions out, it's clear that carbon removal is not just a technical puzzle, it's also a very difficult communications puzzle. So that's our subject matter today. And we're joined by three people who are going to help us hopefully work this puzzle out. So before I introduce our three speakers, let me invite Annalise Straw, our program manager at the Institute, just to tell you a little about how the webinar will run. Annalise.
Great, thanks Simon. I'm excited for everyone to be here today. So the webinar will run, just keep your cameras off just as they are. This is wonderful. We are recording the webinar session, so we want to make sure that the panelists are front and center, and we will let everyone know when the webinar is posted on our website and our YouTube channel. So for the question and answer portion of this webinar, we're going to be using the chat function in Zoom. So it can be found on the left-hand side. So just chat to the general group or directly to me if you'd like, but actually let's just keep it in the public chat channel. And I will be pulling and giving Simon the questions for the question and answer portion. And feel free to jot those questions down as they come to you throughout the session. Back to you, Simon.
Thank you, Annalise. So to our speakers, three speakers with us today. Matthew Nisbet is Professor of Communication, Public Policy, and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. He's Editor-in-Chief of the journal Environmental Communication, and he's a monthly columnist at Issues in Science and Technology magazine. Matt is the author of a new report titled The Carbon Removal Debate, asking critical questions about climate change futures. This is a report that's available through our website, carbonremoval.info. Our second speaker today is Angela Anderson. She is Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Prior to joining the Union of Concerned Scientists, Angela worked as the Program Director at the US Climate Action Network, USCAN. And third, certainly not least, is Hunter Cutting, who's Director of Strategic Communications at Climate Nexus. Prior to joining Climate Nexus, Hunter, among many other things, built the Energy and Climate Division of Resource Media, and helped to launch and lead We Interrupt This Message, a national media strategy center dedicated to social justice. One final thing before we turn to Matt to kick us off. We ask that you treat today's webinar as not for attribution, to allow a free-flowing conversation. If you'd like to follow up with any of the speakers after the event, please be in touch with us via our website, carbonremoval.info. Turning to you, Matt.
Okay, great. So to kick things off and to try to frame discussion and generate hopefully a diversity of ideas and thoughts. I've prepared less than about 6 minutes of remarks that are culled from the report that I wrote, and also a related column I wrote at Issues in Science and Technology magazine. So I'm going to go over those remarks and then turn it over for the panel and your questions. Okay, so here we go. For nearly half a century, the Drax power station in Yorkshire, England, was the country's largest coal-powered electricity generator and a giant source of heat-trapping carbon dioxide pollution. But in recent months, Drax has transitioned from coal to burning wood pellets as engineers test methods for efficiently capturing the carbon dioxide produced and burying it underground in an effort to create negative emissions. Among the pathways that the IPCC has identified for achieving the temperature targets stipulated by the 2015 UN Paris Agreement, only a handful rely exclusively on efforts to reduce or mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. The majority of climate strategies instead require the massive deployment of carbon removal and storage methods also referred to as negative emissions technologies designed to clean up existing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Approximately 20 to 40% of annual greenhouse gas emissions today come from sources such as agriculture and transportation that will be exceedingly difficult to eliminate. Theoretically, one advantage of pursuing carbon removal strategies is that reducing the climate impacts of these and other tough to decarbonize sectors does not require that human-caused emissions cease altogether, but that the net total of emissions is less than or equal to the amount captured and stored by natural and human-made sinks. Although a range of carbon removal methods exist, most IPCC scenarios anticipate the building of thousands of bioenergy and carbon capture and storage plants, similar to England's Drax installation. Yet BECCS as a technology remains at the preliminary research and assessment stage, with a great deal of uncertainty regarding technical feasibility, costs, risks, and social acceptability. Other carbon removal methods, such as direct air capture, reforestation, and soil sequestration, face similarly formidable challenges. Because of their speculative nature, relying on carbon removal to accomplish the goals of the Paris Agreement is, quote, a trick that comes perilously close to magical thinking, writes The Economist. Still, carbon removal options remain politically appealing. The scientific models relied on by the IPCC to estimate pathways for meeting Paris Agreement goals assume that the discounted costs of negative emissions technologies will eventually be less than the current cost of relying on existing fossil fuel mitigation options. The enthusiasm for carbon removal also reflects a tendency to favor techno-fixes as a means to bypass difficult politics. If it is too contentious and costly to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels, why not invent new technology and methods, always just around the corner in the near future, that sidestep contentious debate? Yet overlooked in this line of thinking is that the pursuit of planet-wide carbon removal will likely introduce its own set of intractable controversies. Building a vast industrial negative emissions infrastructure that competes with agricultural production and poses threats to land rights and local ways of life is a strategy guaranteed to produce more politics, not less. All too familiar clashes are likely to surface over the proper role of markets versus government, international governance versus national autonomy, fairness and equity, and the balancing of benefits against precaution in the face of risks, uncertainty, and costs. So, given the perceived urgency of climate change, carbon removal methods have been talked about only in the most ambitious of schemes rather than a more useful frame of right-sized approaches. Quote, many candidate carbon removal technologies have the potential to be the foundation for strong enterprises capturing many millions of tons of carbon dioxide per year in locations where each approach makes sense technically and economically, with a favorable mix of co-benefits and side effects, the climate scientists Chris Field and Mock have noted recently. It is at much larger scales, billions of tons of carbon dioxide per year, that the technologies warrant concern, they write. Grandiose thinking, I argue in the report about carbon removal, must be replaced by a constant questioning process that draws on a plurality of perspectives. How, for example, should research and innovation take place? What might be the unintended consequences of a technology? Who gets to decide on the deployment of carbon removal technologies, and who is responsible for addressing the problems they create? Which values, interpretations, and worldviews matter? Will carbon removal technologies be deployed to benefit the public interest or on behalf of special interests? How should this conversation and the disagreements that ensued be structured? What are the principles and criteria that should apply? Numerous social science studies demonstrate that on complex decisions such as those involving negative emissions technologies, individuals, including experts, are likely to make poor decisions and think less productively if conventional wisdom is defended to the exclusion of dissenting voices. In contrast, exposure to dissent, even when such counter-arguments prove to be wrong, tends to broaden thinking, leading individuals to think in more open ways in multiple directions and in consideration of a greater diversity of options, recognizing flaws and weaknesses in positions. Facilitating constructive agreement around carbon removal strategies will depend on institutions and funders making a sustained commitment to the intellectuals, journalists, forums, and institutions capable of exposing faulty assumptions, expanding the range of options, and convening discussions that lead people from different perspectives to think through and agree on solutions, but often for different reasons. And we can talk about some of those specific investments that are needed and some specific examples during the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Matt. So turning to Angela.
Great. Well, thank you, Simon, for the opportunity to speak to everyone here, and thank you so much, Matt, for your work on the report. I found it really thought-provoking, and I think some really really valuable principles for how we foster around this thorny topic. Let me just give you a bit of a sense of where I'm coming from on the topic. Most of these comments are my own. I direct the climate energy program at Union of Concerned Scientists, and we're in the midst of a robust conversation about how we work on carbon dioxide removal and what kind of positions we should take, what kind of safeguards we want to advocate for. So by no means is anything that I'm about to say a formal consensus position yet at UCS. But what I can tell you is that our climate scientists at UCS, and I'm sure the cadre of folks that they work with, have talked about the need for negative emissions for quite some time now. When we did our strategic planning document back in 2014, we recognized the need for negative emissions in that document then. So it was certainly pre-Paris, and that we've known that this might be a possibility. Our energy analysts are taking a look at how we meet those mid-century net negative goals globally and more specifically in the U.S. And frankly, the falling costs of renewable energy is the fabulous success story of the last few years. And so that has given us a lot of hope for the potential for decarbonization, but the time frame under which we need to do it, as well as the need to electrify and kind of build in more renewable energy to accommodate the electrification of transportation, makes the whole notion of being able to get decarbonized by mid-century a little daunting. And then I think the last thing I would say is that while the emergency frame does make it pretty difficult to have the kind of sober conversation we'd like to have about carbon dioxide removal and how this technology, as well as the technologies and the natural solutions, are going to play in our overall pathways to decarbonization and to net negative, it certainly makes it hard to have that conversation. It is kind of a reality. It's where we are. Our failure to act very aggressively until this point, and hopefully that's going to change soon, has surfaced the fact that some extraordinary measures may well be necessary. The reason I think it's really important that we start and accelerate the conversation about negative emissions is it feels to me a bit like where the climate community was probably a decade or so ago on adaptation. We were really afraid to talk about and elevate adaptation because we thought it would take the wind out of the sails of our need to reduce emissions and to aggressively mitigate. And it didn't take terribly long for us to realize that adaptation was something we had to address for a whole host of reasons, and that it was kind of essential for the global south, for equity issues, and also actually to engage a broader swath of the populace concerned about climate change, in addition to changing their light bulbs and doing all the things they can do to reduce emissions, giving some confidence that we are actually building a more resilient infrastructure, more resilient society was really, really important to folks. And I think negative emissions, if we are able to, and carbon dioxide removal, if we're able to talk about it as the package of the portfolio of things that it is, from natural solutions to the potential for some technological solutions, certainly there's going to be options that folks don't like and are concerned about. But my sense is that for a lot of this increasingly alarmed public, and we've seen for the first time in the Six Americas study that Yale has been doing for quite some time now, that it's the first time that 31% of Americans are alarmed by climate change. That alarm can help mobilize the demand for public policy that will reduce emissions, but it can also kind of get people stuck and make them feel very defeated. And so if their understanding that in addition to rapid decarbonization, we do have the potential for nature-based solutions and potentially some technological solutions, if they're done right, I think can provide some hope, some much-needed hope. I also think it's really, the other audience that I'm concerned about, in addition to that engaged public, are two other audiences that I really think need to be actively engaged in this conversation. One are NGOs and advocates. We are rightly very, very focused on how do we decarbonize, how do we get there, what are the rules that should happen and the policies in our countries and the global climate negotiations. But if we don't confront the range of carbon dioxide removal, the kinds of the guardrails we might want to put around it to make sure these safer and less risky options are the ones that we accelerate the quickest, if we're not having that conversation, I worry that it'll be dominated by industry folks who really see it as potentially a way to offset or buy them more time. And if we're not in that conversation, if we're just in a just say no posture, I worry that they'll kind of carry the day. And that if we're actively engaged in that conversation, we can move the debate and the actions at a national and an international level towards safer options and to put some guardrails around the more risky ones. The last one is policymakers. It's really important for policymakers to be hearing from activists and NGOs because the kinds of investment we need in research and in policies that will accelerate natural solutions investment and deployment, that's not going to happen naturally. We're going to have to advocate for that. And so coming to a consensus about what we're comfortable advocating for is critical in the next few months, in my estimation, but certainly over the next couple of years. And the messages I'd like to, would you like me to stop there, Simon? Am I taking too long? Okay, just checking. Here's the emphasis, the messages I think are really important around this topic. One is that job one is decarbonization. There's no more greater immediate need than to reduce emissions and deployment of renewables. The second piece is hope. I really find that there is an incredible amount of fatalism right now, and being able to engage folks in how possible it is to both reduce emissions and potentially engage natural solutions, and in the long run, potentially some technical solutions can give some folks hope. I think the other key message is that carbon dioxide removal is not an offset. I think that might be one of the biggest benefits of the IPCC raising the conversation, is it's made it clear that natural solutions has always, have for a long time, been viewed as a way to offset polluting the emissions from energy exploration, et cetera. Utilities for years were buying credits to stop in areas where we could avoid deforestation and in tropical forests. While there was a role for that, certainly at a time, now we're in a mode of net negative emissions, and we really can't afford to have CDR become an offset option. It's got to be a net negative option. And the last one is that I think there's a lack of conversation about non-fossil or non-fuels. So what do you do with the captured carbon if you are capturing it technologically? Most of the conversation is focused on burying it underground in saline aquifers or in existing to use for enhanced oil recoveries, when there is an incredible opportunity to use that captured carbon for very carbon-intensive materials like concrete. And one of the advocacy areas I'd like to see more attention paid to is ways that we can begin talking about the kind of the win-win solutions where we're replacing carbon-intensive materials with the captured carbon. And that's just an area that there's a lot more work to be done on.
Angela, thanks so much. So we have questions starting to pop up in the chat box. Please keep adding to that set of questions as they occur to you. One question was about, from Sandra, can you provide examples of technologies available for carbon removal? We're not going to get into that too much today, but if you'd like some more information about particular types of carbon removal approach, please go to our website, carbonremoval.info. You'll find lots of fact sheets and some introductory information about approaches to carbon removal. Other questions we'll address once we've heard from Hunter.
Thanks. I just want to talk a little bit about how carbon drawdown or carbon dioxide removal is being talked about in the media and in some of the themes that we see emerging. As Angela sort of flagged, developing public support is a necessary task to get the right policies and the right investments. And that public support is going to depend in good part on how the public conversation is framed. Climate Nexus conducts an ongoing audit of the media coverage on all climate issues, and we focused in on carbon drawdown over the last couple of years, basically going back to the lead up to the IPCC 1.5 report. And so I just wanted to share with you some of the themes that we see emerging out of that media coverage. Over the last 6 months in particular, there has been an emergence in coverage. Coverage has really blossomed, and it's been driven by the aviation announcements, EasyJet and Delta, for example, the corporate investment announcements, like by Microsoft and Stripe, and the increasing adoption of net zero policies. The IPCC land report this last summer actually helped jumpstart this wave. And I would also note that in the US in particular, stories on agricultural carbon drawdown have really jumped up. So that's one thing I want to flag, is that the game is on. The media is now paying attention to this topic, and I think it's only going to grow going forward. The second thing I want to flag is there is considerable confusion in the media coverage. These stories are just confused. That's just a constant thing we see again and again and again. And then I also want to point out in particular that in a lot of these stories, carbon drawdown and carbon capture and sequestration are very often conflated. And that's due to the fact that this is just a complex, complicated topic. Both of those topics are complex and complicated. It appears that there is an industry propaganda campaign to conflate carbon capture and sequestration with carbon drawdown. And then the other confounding dynamic is that we have policy packages here, at least in the United States, running through Congress that actually package carbon capture and sequestration with carbon drawdown. So oftentimes you end up seeing those two very different topics being conflated. We actually have a science backgrounder disentangling those two and sort of explains why they should not be discussed or grouped together, that we're going to be publishing next week, and hopefully we can circulate that at that time. I also want to flag that there is a huge spread in how the issue of carbon drawdown is framed and in the themes that appear in the story. There is many competing frames at play. And so the downside, of course, is that this makes it just very confusing for anyone who's trying to follow along at home. But it also means that there's an opportunity really to get in there and help frame the coverage first. And as Angela talked about, we're not the only folks that are trying to educate and inform the public, and other people are as well. And so I think, like I said, the game clock has started, and we need to get in there. So I'm going to just quickly run down some of the themes that we see appearing in the coverage. I'm not advocating for or against any of these frames or themes. I'm just going to flag that they're out there and available, and we should think through which ones could be most helpful for getting the public to understand and bringing the public up to speed. So, and again, this is in no particular order. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly here. Happy to talk later with other folks. There's the Plan B theme. Carbon drawdown is sort of positioned as a backstop in case we don't reduce carbon pollution fast enough. Geoengineering is also invoked in this frame as well. There's the climate restoration theme, which is that we need to draw carbon pollution back down out of the atmosphere so that our grandchildren can have the climate that our grandparents remember. There's the both and theme that Angela flagged. We need to reduce carbon pollution dramatically, and we need to draw carbon pollution back down out of the atmosphere. The Microsoft announcement is a good example of that kind of framing. Another frame is that we're just not cutting pollution fast enough, and so that we also need to draw carbon pollution back down out of the atmosphere. This is sort of a way of sort of highlighting the cost of delay is how you often see this thing. There's the win-win frame. Drawing carbon back down out of the atmosphere and putting it to use in new products will be a win-win. There's the innovation salvation frame, where carbon drawdown is sort of often posed as a sort of a savior. There's a sort of a modern version of that frame where it's just positioned as sort of the benefit of innovation. Research and development is heavily featured in this theme. Oftentimes stories are structured as natural drawdown versus engineered drawdown. And this stems from the UN report, which explicitly categorized the options that way, and other publications. Occasionally we will see stories centered around the perverse incentive. Again, this is more of a US-centric theme, but we often see carbon drawdown discussed in the context of enhanced oil recovery operations. Carbon drawdown is often packaged with geoengineering, and geoengineering is the theme. You see some of the sub-themes in this: technical fixes to save the world. BECCS is often heavily featured here. I would note that there appears to be a decline in the share of stories devoted to BECCS, and those stories are now more critical. There's the planting trees theme, which of course we've just seen a lot of recently, and this invokes natural fixes to save the world. In the US, there's definitely a growing trend of farming and saving farmers, and carbon drawdown is specifically invoked in that context. It's less about saving the climate, but it's more about saving rural communities and saving the farmers. Again, this is a bit of a US-centric theme. Part of it is that the US farm economy is in crisis. We're currently experiencing near record highs bankruptcies. Bankruptcies are the highest they've been in a very long time. And in fact, many of you may have seen the recent announcement this morning or last night by the US Ag Secretary formally endorsing carbon prices, the first cabinet secretary to do that under Trump. And that's simply got to do with the fact that the farm community in the US is in crisis, and they see carbon drawdown as an opportunity to help reinvigorate them. Two last ones. Carbon drawdown, as Angela mentioned, is often framed as an offset, and we see this frequently in the focus in stories on aviation and also in stories about personal carbon footprints. And then finally, carbon drawdown is often sort of featured as a futuristic scenario, and it's all sort of future-oriented. In that frames, it's really not sort of primed as an issue for us to grapple with today, but something that the scientists are thinking about far down the road. We're only beginning to sort of process these frames for ourselves, but I do want to flag a couple recommendations for you, one of which I think echoes Angela here. And one is to identify your goal and your audience at the get-go, because audiences are in very different places. The conversations with policymakers is in a very different place than the conversation with the general public. And broad communication is going to cross those audiences. The more narrowly you define your audience, the greater clarity you're going to have in making those communication choices. And I mean, this is sort of a truism that's always in place when you do communications work, but I think it's really important right now where we are in the public conversation about carbon drawdown, because different audiences are in such different places. I think it's really important in this work. And then the other recommendation I want to offer is that you to monitor your language. There is a lot of confusion and conflation, particularly around carbon capture versus carbon drawdown. I actually want to offer you to never use that word carbon capture and use the term carbon drawdown when you're comfortable using that term. Because like I said, there is just a great deal of confusion right now in the media coverage, and I think one thing we can do is help bring clarity to that. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Hunter. So picking up on that very final point, there's a question here about the distinction that you drew between, how did you put it, CCS versus carbon drawdown. Could you just explain that a little more?
Well, I actually think Matthew or Angela would be more expert in that, but I'll take a crack at it. Carbon capture is when you actually keep carbon dioxide from getting into the atmosphere in the first place, and carbon drawdown is when you pull it down out of the atmosphere after it's gotten into the atmosphere. And the most common practice for carbon capture is, for instance, if you've got a coal-fired power plant or a gas-fired power plant, and it has a smokestack, and you burn the gas or you burn the coal, and the CO2 goes up the smokestack and into the atmosphere. Well, you can put in technology to actually capture that carbon out of the waste gas before that gas gets in the atmosphere. And so that's carbon capture. Carbon drawdown is what do you do after the carbon dioxide has escaped into the atmosphere. It's sort of loose in the wild already, if you will. And so those are the two broad distinctions. I don't know if Matthew or Angela want to add on.
I think the only thing I would offer is that I think of carbon capture or at a power plant, for example, as kind of like the pollution control equipment we would put on a power plant to stop smog and ozone. It stops the carbon. So it could potentially make the plant carbon neutral, but it does not give you a negative emissions. It doesn't contribute to the negative emissions that we're going to need.
Matt, we have you on mute. All right, try that.
So I just think as a general thing to think about, as a communication researcher and working with different groups, just historically I've done a lot of work on framing and messaging. And as I started working on this project, and I put together like a literature review where I stacked all the scientific publications and commentaries written in the various expert, National Academies reports, etc. My general takeaway in spending a lot of time writing the report was my feeling that is way too early to start to think about messaging on the issue. In part, one of the general questions to ask is, at this point, and specific to what technologies or approaches, what role, if anything, is there for public opinion, and which publics are we talking about? So, what is your theory of change, and how does that relate to the role for the opinions of various publics and decision makers? Which decision makers count? Which stakeholders count? Which members of the lay public count? And then the other thing is just in thinking about messaging is just being true and honest in dealing with complexity and uncertainty, and making sure that you're not moving forward with messaging without first stepping back and questioning your own assumptions and taking a critical look at the assumptions that are driving expert analysis right now and other things. And that's what I try to do in the report. So I'm wary about already jumping towards things like, do we call it carbon removal? When I look through the expert literature, there's two terms: negative emissions technologies and carbon removal, and climate drawdown or carbon drawdown really doesn't show up in the expert literature. And that's sort of like a frame device that was really kind of interjected by the Drawdown project in the book, which I think is great reading. So I don't know. I don't know how to move forward with these different terms. I think it's kind of like, do you call it climate change or global warming? And there's been a lot of debate, and there's no consensus in the literature about whether one term is more engaging than the other. And even though that Frank Luntz is blamed for advising Republicans to call it climate change, it's because it's less alarming. If you look at actually how conservatives and Republicans talk about it and write about it today, they talk about it as global warming, right? And the research literature is unclear whether it makes a difference how you label it. So Again, this is such a complex issue, and it's so new on the agenda as an emerging issue. Before we even move to messaging, we have to answer those questions of, whose opinions count? What is our goal of communication, dialogue, and engagement before we even think about messaging? And then also, does starting to think about messaging or even engagement itself get in the way of kind of the critical discussion we have to have about the expert assumptions and the peculiar things about each one of these carbon removal or negative emission technologies that introduce their own set of political dynamics and their own communication imperatives and needs. So I'll stop there.
Simon, could I just tag on really quickly?
Please do, Hunter. Yeah.
I just want to say amen to all the questions that Matthew flagged. We need to answer them. The only thing I would say is we need to answer them like yesterday. This idea that we can wait and figure these out is gone. That the media stories are already happening. Reporters are going to be calling you up and interviewing you. You need to know what your messaging is now. So yeah, I get it that it's these are tough questions and we don't have the answers. I'm not saying we have the answers, but I am saying you could get a call tomorrow from a reporter and you're gonna have to say something. You're gonna have to use some terms, some labels, use some framing. So I do think we need to at least have tentative solutions in place right now.
So Angela, can I turn to you? So there were some questions about why civil society organizations are finding it hard to even come up with some public stances around carbon removal. And then some questions also emerging about who the appropriate audience ought to be at this point. Questions about how to reach US Congress, about how to reach other NGOs or civil society actors. And this kind of brings together some of the comments from Hunter and Matt. Who should be a part of the conversation and in what ways right now?
Right. So, as I mentioned, I'm really concerned about the lack of not a frame, a consensus, a general approach around negative emissions among the leading climate groups and engaging the environmental justice community that we have are really just beginning to do a better job of engaging around climate solutions generally. So for me, that's kind of the essential target audience. The next level is really the research investment that is needed and or the acceleration of investment in natural solutions. There's still some research that's needed on the natural solutions too, in terms of measurement, verification, and designing systems to track that and make sure it needed to deliver. And as I said, that those investments or those research decisions don't happen naturally. You need a coalition of folks to push for them. So those are the immediate audiences. I think the broader, I wouldn't call it the general public, but maybe the engaged public on this conversation, as Hunter said, I think we have to have some language and a way to speak to them, because the articles are out there. There is a frame that is going to be developed, and if we're not helping to shape it, it may not be the frame that we think is most useful to advance both decarbonization and ultimate ability to go negative.
Matt, can I invite you back?
Just one thing to add to that. I think there's two ways to think about engaging and working with journalists, right? So the one way is to think about, okay, so a journalist is going to call you, and there is a lot of confusion in coverage, and this is a difficult issue to talk about. So what is our messaging strategy? What are our talking points? What are the frame devices we're going to use? What kind of narratives are important for us to emphasize, right? But the other way to think about it is more around this idea of journalism education, right? So who are the groups and funders who have the credibility to convene journalists together and kind of embed them within a conversation, an honest conversation about uncertainty and ethics and conflict of interest and hype and politics, so that out of those types of conversations, journalists develop a much deeper knowledge set about negative emissions technologies and the ability to ask the right types of critical questions. But everyone involved also starts to develop not only that type of critical knowledge and starts to have their own kind of point of view on this evolve in a way that engages with different perspectives. But out of that also there starts to emerge a common language among the various participants in trying to develop in a responsible and honest way various forms of carbon removal and negative emissions. So I think we need a lot more convening and discussion and dialogue that involves journalists along with a diversity of experts and groups in that type of conversation. Because right now we're kind of flying blind in terms of saying sort of a wait back and see what journalists are going to ask us, and then hopefully we can come up with just the right message that promotes clarity. I just don't see that working.
If I can, Andrew, you might want in on this too, but I think it's more of a yes and situation. Absolutely, we need to be able to engage journalists on just basic education. Some of the questions are being asked here. What types of carbon dioxide removal? What are the risks and the concerns about those various technologies? What would it take? All of those questions would be great to have a series of conversations with journalists, and again among the NGO community as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean, and I don't think we're ever going to get it exactly right either. People's messages are going to vary, but we're going to have to educate them in a formal setting, but also be ready on the fly to help shape and with the conversation as it comes up in policymaking venues, in the media, and other places too.
I'll just add real quickly. I think one of the institutions that can provide the place for forums and dialogue and conversation and education among all groups involved, including experts, are universities, particularly land-grant universities. And there's two reasons for that. Universities as expert institutions, in some places they are viewed as advocates, but in other places for most of us, they're still viewed as honest brokers. But a lot of these issues where the politics are involved and also the deployment and the adoption of carbon removal techniques and technologies will happen in the United States right now at the state and local level. And in the places where public opinion will matter the most is likely to be at the local and state level, because it's engaging with various stakeholders to get them to adopt practices. And as I write about in the report, but at the same time, understanding that lay publics and farmers and business people are experts in their own right, and they have a set of experiences and a set of knowledge that should inform what NGOs are doing, what experts and engineers are doing, what industry is doing. And the more consultation that can happen, there's a difference between messaging and consultation. Sometimes your best way to message is through consultation. The more consultation that happens, the more likely you are to make sure that lines of trust are maintained or built, and the more likely you are to make better decisions. So I think land-grant universities, through their agricultural extension, through their alumni networks, through their partnerships with industry and NGOs, through their partnerships with state government leaders and also congressional delegations, I think they can really be like sort of hubs of engagement and innovation when it comes to carbon removal, just like they should be hubs of engagement and innovation when it comes to farming practices or renewable energy. So I think we have a tendency to overlook the central role that particularly state land-grant universities can and should play in places from the Midwest to the West Coast, to New York State and other places. So,
great. So we're getting some good thoughts about how a conversation might be structured. There are also some questions popping up about the sorts of things that need to be guarded against in any conversation around carbon removal. and in particular that there are some people asking questions about the so-called moral hazard. So that the moral hazard notion is that even just kind of introducing the notion of carbon removal into the world might get in the way of emissions abatement. Might just kind of, as Angela put it in her remarks, take the wind out of the sails of all of the work that needs to be done to stop carbon from getting into the atmosphere in the first place. So thoughts from any of you about the sorts of things that need to be guarded against in the conversation about carbon removal and how to kind of put those guards in place?
Well, I think the genie's already out of the box. I mean, if you look at the IPCC reports, you could, from that line of reasoning, right? I understand the moral hazard concerns, and I write about it in the report, especially when you get at the level of sort of the grandiose thinking that comes out of the IPCC reports in terms of making what it would take in terms of carbon removal deployment to realize a 1.5 or 2 degree target. But if the concern is around moral hazard, that we shouldn't be talking about carbon removal because it's a moral hazard, then you shouldn't be talking about the IPCC reports, because those are a central feature of the models in terms of making 1.5 or 2 degrees work. And so you can't avoid the discussion. If anything, right, as I talk about in the report in the column I wrote, not enough attention has been paid to the central role of carbon removal in IPCC models for 1.5 degrees. And the wishful thinking around the deployment of things like BECCS in order to make those models work, right? To sort of create the illusion that a political goal is possible, scientifically, technically, and socially. The political goal of 1.5 that was arrived at Paris. The only way that it happens is according to the IPCC is sort of this magical deployment at this mass level of BECCS, right? So, again, it's already out there. You have to talk about it. You can talk about it critically and get at those assumptions, as I talk about in my report, but you can't avoid it.
I think that some of the... Go ahead, Angela.
Go ahead, Hunter, please.
No, Angela. I would always defer to you first.
Well, there's a bunch of things. I absolutely think we have to talk about the moral hazard. There is no one technology on the renewable side or any of the pathways we're talking about how to reduce emissions at the level that we need to is going to do the trick. It's always a portfolio of options, and there are some that are better and safer, and there are some that are less safe, and we want to use less of if we can do that. So I think in terms of the moral hazard, I really do. I don't know that I have the answer, but I think we do have to guard against the notion that carbon dioxide removal is going to somehow make it easier to reduce the emissions that we have to reduce and to get to decarbonization. And that's why I think we need to be in the conversation. The second thing, I think that it's essential to have it in the conversation. I just have to one comment about the IPCC. They were given a really difficult challenge. I think before Paris, most of us that were engaged in the international negotiations or talking amongst ourselves and watching our failure, our inability to ratchet down emissions, we were going in the wrong direction. The notion of how do you get below 2, how do you get below 2 degrees? Are we going to lose? Are we going to lose the possibility of even getting there? That was the moment of despair I remember before that report was asked for. And in terms of the array of options, the land sector, be it soil or trees, they are incredible victims of climate change. So our ability to have that become our source of removals, we absolutely need to enhance and perhaps is more near term, but it faces a lot of challenges just in terms of wildfires and drought and the other issues that make it harder to keep that carbon in the ground or in the forest. So I think that IPCC wasn't left with a lot of great options. Now what I'm seeing in the modeling is instead of BECCS as a stand-in for the array of potential removal solutions, we're now seeing direct air capture as the stand-in. And the bottom line is the models are really helpful and really necessary for us to begin to craft a pathway that policymakers can relate to, that we can use to challenge industry and others on to do what they need to do to meet the targets. They are imperfect. There are ways to make them better, but I do think that they are a really helpful and necessary tool. And I think that we have to get better at how to incorporate the array of CDR options into those pathways.
So Hunter, let me invite you in. I know we can disappear down at least a 10-minute rabbit hole on the IPCC. So if we can turn back to the moral hazard question and others popping up in the chat box. Hunter.
Yeah, no, I think the moral hazard question, I mean, as Angela said, is something we do have to address head on. And it's not theoretical. We see it in the media coverage. There are stories about carbon dioxide removal, or whatever term you want to use, that paint it as a panacea. Like, we're going to be able to fix this stuff. In fact, we're going to draw down so much carbon, and then we're going to be able to sell it to people, and it'll be a win-win, and it'll just be great. And I mean, I've seen those stories. So it very much is it is a threat, and as Angela said, that's part of the reason why we need to get into the media stories to guard against that. So I do think like Angela said, I don't think we figured it out, but I do think the both and framing that comes up quite a lot is definitely helpful. I thought the Microsoft announcement was very clear about that. They were crystal clear about that they need to do emissions reductions in line with the IPCC 1.5 report. And they need to do the carbon drawdown in line with the 1.5 report. And that was a very nice, I thought, benchmark that we should be asking other corporate players to hold to as well. So yeah, I'll stop there. Do you want me to address the thing about the farming community? I thought somebody asked about that.
Go for it, please.
I think Matt is right. A lot of the play is at the state level, but I think if we are all hoping that we're going to have a whole new federal level play, right? And in fact, all those bills are being introduced now. Like, all the marker bills are being set now, and the ag community knows it. I mean, Sherry Bustos, put out a whole, blueprint for the ag community. So they smell the dollars. They know it's there. So I think there's a real, and I think, although the amount of emissions reductions is relatively small, and the amount of carbon drawdown is relatively small in the ag sector, they are such an important political player, and they have been such an important blocker on climate action that I think it's really critically important that we engage with that community, because carbon drawdown is something that they even know the language. They even got their own. The unique opportunity is the way they all talk about it in the farming community. They're all very well aware. So there's this weird dynamic where there's a lot of, as we know, there's a lot of climate denialism in the ag community, and a lot of folks who just don't get it. But the leadership of the farming community very much does get it. They know the science. They're waiting for the opportunity to help their rural communities, and that opportunity may hopefully come in 2021. So we'll see.
Okay, there are some technical questions again popping up in the box that we're not going to have a lot of time to get into. One of the questions is about why all the focus on carbon when there are other greenhouse gases as well. And so one of the other things you sometimes see in this conversation is talk about greenhouse gas removal and not just carbon removal. Of course, carbon dioxide is the gas we pay most attention to because it's doing the most harm. Matt, are there other things that you want to make sure that we take away? Oh, Hunter, go ahead.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, the second big greenhouse gas, right, is methane, and methane and carbon dioxide operate very differently in the atmosphere, right? And so that's part of the reason I think why we focus on carbon dioxide when it comes to removals. Methane washes out of the atmosphere fairly quickly, whereas carbon stays in the atmosphere for up to centuries. So I do think that it does make sense to have a little bit extra emphasis on carbon dioxide in particular.
Good, thank you.
I guess
that's something everyone on the call practically knows, but I thought I would just flag it.
Right.
again, as a communication researcher, I've just been doing this for, I guess I started graduate school 20 years ago, right? And I the first 10 or 12 years, I was really focused on messaging and general public opinion. And the more I worked on that, I realized that, the same dynamics that lead to faulty judgments and biases among the general public, similar dynamics are happening, within the climate community itself, within the expert community, within the academic community. Right? We all are subject to our own faulty biases and assumptions, and it becomes even worse when we're operating under perceived conditions of an urgency, and also, extreme political polarization. So my best advice, the two best pieces of advice I can say is one is, we all have to be skeptics and critics of hype, right? And the danger, whether it's direct air capture or it's natural climate solutions, is that each one of these processes, or planting 1 trillion trees, they're just talked about uncritically at a very superficial level, and they're hyped as solutions. And we don't look at we don't talk honestly about the limits of those solutions, the uncertainties, the conflicts of interest, and also the real socio-political challenges in actually deploying them at the level that people are talking about. Even something like tree planting, right? And many of those challenges are going to happen at the local level. And so we need to help journalists and news organizations in ways that journalists and news organizations can ask those critical questions. We need to call out others within our community, whether it's academia or the NGO community, that are not being true to uncertainty and are glossing over or simplifying the big complexity of these questions, and in some cases engaging in exaggeration and hype. And then the second takeaway is that we have to embrace the valuable role of disagreement, in that the only way we make better decisions is not only to constantly question our assumptions and to enable criticism and skepticism, but to invest in forums where a diversity of people can come together and talk about their perspectives, talk about what they argue as our solutions, what their concerns are, and use those forums as a way to not necessarily generate consensus, but recognize that not everyone has to believe the same thing to support the same goal, right? Even people who might deny human activities lead to climate change may support elements of, say, agricultural policy that leads to drawdown, for example, right? So, I think it's, only by listening, only by consulting, only by engaging in a sort of facilitated disagreement can we make better decisions, but also get people who believe very different things sometimes to support the same action, whether it's in Congress or at the local level. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Matt. So that gives us just a minute each for Hunter and Angela for final remarks.
I thought Matt did a fabulous job wrapping it up right there. This is going to be a difficult conversation, as is the drive to reduce emissions. There are some opportunities here. I agree we should not overhype them, but there's an element of just not wanting to talk about this because of the disagreements that we have to get over, and we have to have the conversation and arrive at where the areas of agreement are, and there is some urgency to doing that. It took 20 years to commercialize solar and get it to the place where it's playing the role it is right now. The discussion now, and the need to have the discussion now, is so that in 20 years, if we need it, we've done the prep work.
Thank you, Angela. Hunter.
I'll leave it with Angela.
Oh, that seems cheeky.
What? I mean, I'm not going to follow that act, so.
Well, so you've left me with 30 seconds just to wrap things up then. Thanks to each of you for contributing today. Hunter, we clearly don't pay you enough. we have so many questions in the chat box we didn't have a chance to answer. There needs to be a follow-on conversation. We've had an invitation from people like Stefan Singer in the chat box to come and talk with us about some international activities, calls in the chat box for a diversity of voices to be involved even in the conversation about the conversation. And so we need to be attentive to that as we set up additional webinars. So I appreciate all of the comments here. A couple of things as we wrap. Matt's report is available at our website, carbonremoval.info. Please engage with it. Send us your comments on the report. Also, you will find this webinar posted there in a couple of weeks once it's been captioned, and prior webinars from the series are available there. We have 2 upcoming webinars, one on oceans-based carbon removal and governance of oceans-based approaches, and a second webinar on enhanced weathering and mineralization. And there will have to be follow-on webinars on this theme as well. So thank you all for being with us today. Again, I'm Simon Nicholson with the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy. Angela, Hunter, Matt, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Bye.
Thank you all.